Hi everyone, welcome, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Devorah Brous. Hi Devorah, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Wonderful. So Devorah is based in LA, so we're across the pond having this conversation today. And to give you a little bit of context, Devorah is a TEDx speaker, an urban homesteader, a frontline community organizer, and the creator of From Soil to Soul, a nonprofit founding executive director for nearly 20 years. Today, Devorah is a consultant, a writer, and a ritualist that is deeply rooted at the nexus of burnout and renewal. So, a theme that's very resonant with the ethos of karma as well. So, Deborah guides individuals and institutions through transformative online sabbaticals that focus on regenerative practices for the inner and outer landscapes. And I'd highly recommend you check out Devorah's TEDx talk called An Antidote to Burnout, the Regenerative Change Cycle. So, those of you who are well acquainted with karma can probably tell and see why this will be such an important conversation to have with Devorah and to learn from her. So, thank you so much for joining me today, Devorah.
Oh, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm excited.
Of course, yes. Well, do you want to just tell us a little bit more about yourself and this sabbatical that you're so focused on within your work, which I think is really fascinating, and I'd be keen to know more about how much of an uptake there is with sabbaticals in the US as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I will just begin by saying I spent almost 20 years on the front lines as a community organizer in a war zone. And so when I hit the wall, I hit it really hard. And there were some pretty severe repercussions to my health. And there oftentimes folks will talk about like a pain to purpose moment where you just have to stop.
Mm,
And that happened to me. And I began to understand that I had been putting it all out into the world. And I hadn't tried to figure out ways of also replenishing some of it to keep my battery charged. So, what happened was I fully burned out. And today, my passion is helping other folks to tune into themselves in order to learn the language of somatics, to feel like an embodied sense of what enough means so
mm,
that we can draw boundaries that are really clear and say, right now, I have to take a break and go outside and sit still for a few minutes and just drink my tea under a tree. I just have to sit still.
mm,
And I think that in today's culture, it's almost impossible to do because we're just all the time expected to be producing. And in
mm,
this grind culture, it's like we don't have a chance to slow down and tap into the inner rhythms of the inner landscape and
mm,
say, oh, I need to water or compost myself. I'm becoming depleted.
mm, mm,
So my work, I'm very passionate about looking at the the origins of the sabbatical,
mm,
and what we know of the sabbatical is that it was designed back in the 1880s to to give something back to the minds of the professors at Harvard who were exhausted. They'd been giving so much of themselves. And sort of what it's become today in the United States, and probably I imagine also in other places in Europe, it's become this sort of gift for folks that have worked at least 7 years at their institutions. They've given of themselves, and the institution says, we will feed you by giving you paid leave to go ahead and kick out that book that you've been wanting to work on
mm,
or catch up on your research because I know you've been lagging. So you have all these responsibilities here at work. And so people end up taking a 4 month break or something like this, but they're
mm,
so harried and frenetic to try to keep up
mm,
that with their own goals or with the goals of their institution, that time is not a time to slow down and renew and
mm,
regenerate.
mm,
And so there's a lot of research out there right now that reveals that up to 75% of millennials have already experienced burnout. And so interestingly, there's only 4% of the corporations in the United States that are funding sabbaticals to try to address what is being caused in the workplace, that people are just, they're getting overwrought, they're getting exhausted. And what happens to the other 96% of the corporations and the people that are making the machinery work in the world today? They're just going and going until they hit their own walls. And so that kind of has me deeply aware that exhaustion and cynicism towards the job and reduced personal and professional efficacy is not the way to thrive. So what I'm really interested in is looking at the ancient sabbatical ideas, and finding ways to think about how the principles of really taking a break once in every 7 years to restore and to replenish and to revitalize is something that we could be bringing back into our cultures, not just in the workplace, but in the ways in which we ways in which we imagine time. We just like to reconfigure our relationship with time.
That makes total sense. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really interested in this this idea of it being every 7 years. Do you know if there's a particular reason behind that?
I don't know the answer to that.
Another question is, do you agree, or do you think it should be a bit more flexible than that?
I believe it should be more flexible. I believe that we should be able to tune into ourselves and say, like, am I producing at my best right now? Am I creative? Am I tapping into my innovative potential? I've been fueling this institution and giving what I've got to it for years. Maybe it's less than 7 years. Maybe it's more. My husband's been working at the same institution for 30 years. And there's part of him that's just like, he keeps going because that's all he's ever known to do. He's never been given a sabbatical. In fact, he didn't even have paternity leave. But it's a powerful institution in this country. So, not only are the institutions different about how they treat their employees, but each of us is different. We have our own kind of biological clocks and our own sort of sense of how to move with our energy in the world. And so I, for one, love the analogy of looking at the regenerative currents of nature. Every single year, nature knows how to take a break. We don't need to take a break only once every 7 years, because that's what's written in Judeo-Christian tradition, around an ancient blueprint. But what I will say is that when I, as a urban homesteader and someone who works with the land, when I look at the leaves of the trees, we grow a lot of fruit trees on our property, and all the leaves are beginning to drop right now. And the process of degeneration is everywhere in our gardenscape. And the trees feed themselves with the carbon, like the process of revitalizing the tree's life before it produces new leaves and new growth, new fruits in the spring, is to feed itself right now in the fall and for the winter, just to rest and lay fallow. And I suppose what I would say is the way sabbaticals practiced in our world today is like, it's only for the pedigree. If only 4% of the corporations can actually afford to give leave to their employees that have served, and then the rest of people are left to take that time on their own, which requires a lot of resources. So sometimes folks are going to take time for their health needs, to address their health crisis, and then try to come back and find that their job has been replaced. A sabbatical shouldn't be for for the privileged few. It shouldn't be just for the pedigree. Like a sabbatical in the ancient sabbatical term is for everyone. It's for the land to lie fallow. It's for the community to figure out ways to rethink the way the practices in our neighborhoods, and find out, if we zoom out and take a different angle, a different look once every 7 years, what might we do differently? It's not something you can do in the day-to-day. So just to go back to your question, I think there is some logic to having some rhythm that is cyclical. You work for 6 and you take a pause for 1 to reflect. Could we do this differently? What if we rejiggered our departments and set our goals a little differently? What if we adapted our theory of change to all the changes that are happening in the country right now, or in the world right now? And I think there's something very, very potent to that.
100%. I really agree with that, actually. It's very empowering to think of it in that way, like, actually, if we did things differently, what could it look like? And just even being open to that, as an idea. But most importantly, what would that bring out from people, rather than feeling overworked and, like you say, just to this grind, which so many people are nowadays. And being in this switched on, ever on culture, with our phones pinging at us all the time, our computers, it's like we're not actually designed to be that switched on all the time as human beings. We do need that time to step back and to reflect and reassess, like you're saying. And I think there's really something to be said for aligning how we exist in the world with nature, because, like, the nature of life in itself is about change and growth and development. So actually, like you said, about having something like cyclical does make sense when we relate it to, why not relate it to work, like we would do with like anything else. And I think people are productive in different ways. So to actually have something that's quite, this is how it is, it's not necessarily going to work for everyone. It's the same thing with, like, with flexible working. When you think about that, how much that has changed, and actually how much more productive it's made people, because just having a straight, like, it is only like 9 to 5, for example, which it usually ends up being more as well. Some people actually, on their sleep cycle, they don't do well at getting up early in the morning, and they do much better in the later in the day. And the same for the opposite. Some people love getting up and they thrive on being an early bird, and they prefer to finish early because they've got a lot of their energy out in the morning. So that's a good example of where actually it's done well for a lot of companies that have embraced flexible working. And this goes to your point about making choices of what could it look like if we did that? What would it mean if we changed things a little bit? So I think that's a really important point right there.
Right, because basically, if we just keep going and going and going, that's the model of sustainability. It's like, let's just keep it going. Let's keep it all the time. Can't afford to pause. We might lose our stride.
Yeah.
There's so much competition out there. But when the people are exhausted and overworked, just like when the land is overused, overexploited, it's not going to produce nutrient-rich vegetables and fruits that will make people healthier because they're eating good food. It's not going to get, you're not going to get the best out of the meetings that are held in the shared office space if half of the people are absolutely fried and just really need to take a moment to catch their breath. And so it's sometimes I feel like these problems are generated in the workplace culture. And so that is the place where these problems need to be redressed. But my sense is that the spiritual technology of what an ancient sabbatical invites us to think about is how to not just like take care of the institution, but how to take care of the people who make the institution function.
Yeah.
Got to
Absolutely.
take care of the people who have been farming your lands for the past 7 years. They have been putting such effort into caring for the trees and composting and pruning the trees and tending the grove. So during that 7th year, the grove basically becomes everyone's property that has worked the land.
Mm,
So it's designed to kind of re-establish balance between growth mindset and rest.
mm,
And we've completely forgotten that kind of medicine that I think can really help
mm,
people who are committed to producing excellence in the world.
mm. Absolutely, because we have so much potential within us, don't we? Every single one of us does. And it is about how do we actually like take the time to tap into that and remind ourselves of what that looks like rather than just keeping going. Because when we do just go from one thing to the next, we're not creating any space to actually find out and remind ourselves and rediscover or discover new, elements of what makes us who we are in our work in all aspects of our lives, right? Um, I think we're on the same page here.
Same page.
Yeah.
And then it also it gives us a chance to figure out, well, instead of just trying to sustain
Mm,
with like added pressures and added responsibilities and added weight of the world,
mhm,
what can we do to help regenerate and bring like that sense of inspiration and
mm.
freshness into the thinking that goes towards our work and towards our relationships
Yeah.
at work.
Yeah, definitely.
Regenerative agriculture like offers a lot of tools for us to really reflect on how to rebuild spent systems.
Mm, mm.
It can be very, very inspiring because I think the regeneration model is the opposite of the degeneration that we see happening all around us.
Yeah.
We don't want to just keep going as we're really seeing such decline in our in the state of the world, in state of in terms of health. Like there's health crisis after health crisis among
Mm,
everyone around me. I don't know if you're experiencing something similar where just so many people are hitting their walls.
mhm, mhm.
It seems to me like what we're doing isn't working. We need to find ways of
Yeah.
working within a regenerative paradigm instead of a degenerative
Yeah,
approach.
absolutely. And you have a regenerative cycle, don't you, that you teach like within your community. Do you want to take us through sort of what the elements of that is?
Oh my goodness, I would really love to.
Yeah.
I love to think about this cycle um, that people use when we're growing food as something that can help us when we're working with um, the day, the time of the day, the week, the month, each season. Like there's a time, like you said, there's a time of day where our bodies can slow down and we can restore by getting a really, really good night's sleep.
Mm,
And now that there are like longer nights and we're slowing our rhythms to work with the cycles of nature, to catch our breath a little bit. It's autumn. I mean,
mm,
it's hibernation time of winter. So these longer nights can afford us a chance to catch up with some of the sleep that we lose during those frenetic months of
mm,
summer when everyone's really busy,
mm,
fall when you're getting back to school and just running, running.
mm,
So this idea begins with fallow. So we don't really know how to do fallow in our culture, but it allows for that space of just noting that we're overheating,
mm,
like that the engine of the planet is overheating, but our own internal engines are also overheating. We're pushing really hard. So fallow is this first step of just slowing down into that place of stillness where we can replenish
mm,
our. I think it's almost invisible in our culture. You don't see when people are aging. People are just, Botoxing and dyeing hair. And you don't see pictures on any social media of like a dying rose or, bushes that are turning yellow and green, turning yellow and dropping their leaves. Like you only see perky, pretty, perfect all the time.
Mm.
So fallow is a chance to actually take note of what is and to hold space for what is.
Yeah.
And so is the next step on my regenerative change cycle, which is this idea of like when you get down on the ground to put a seed into fertile soil,
Mm.
you recognize that you're stepping into another ecosystem. And so that ecosystem is functioning before you enter into it. And if you sow an idea, it has to fit into the existing ecosystem. And so it requires consciousness, like, am I ready to take on this new project? Seems like a huge endeavor.
Mm.
Do I have the resources? Really checking carefully to make sure that there's a good match between what you have and what is and what the conditions are out
Mm.
there in the world that
Mm.
you are sowing into. So, like, for example, you can't plant a Joshua tree in London, right? That's a desert tree. Like, even if you really want to see one, because it's such a fantastic specimen, like you want to grow one, it doesn't make sense. So it's really recalibrating our choices
Mm.
consciously. I think that's super key, and we sort of don't take the chance to do that when we're rushed, or
Mm.
just dealing with what's on your desk and meeting deadlines.
Yeah.
So it's about being strategic and planning.
Mm.
The third space in this regenerative change cycle is all about tending. And for me, probably the most important part about tending is I think we tend to skip this step when we get busy. It's like I had the chance on my birthday a few weeks ago to do a big hike, and I was up at the top of a sizable climb, and it took about 2 hours to get to the peak. And what as I paused, I noticed that many of the people who were climbing were listening to their earbuds, and they climb up to the top and then just kept going. They didn't take a moment to like
Mm.
slow down and pause. There was just that sense of like, I got to keep going because I got to get to work after this, so I got to bust.
Mm.
And so tend is like, let's take a pause to nourish.
Mm.
And I'm not going to fight right now to keep getting there. I'm going to take a moment to tend.
Mm.
Then the final stage in this regenerative change cycle is about harvesting. How do we harvest so that the lessons we've learned through this season of growth can be shared?
Mm.
How do we take the time to recognize the people in our departments, in the office that have been really giving their all? How do we celebrate them? How do we share the gratitude that we feel for the ways in which our team has showed up? Because I think we've all become very good at pointing to where we have faltered. And so harvest is like, it's like, how do we feed the system so that it can regenerate?
Mm.
How, in each of these points along this regenerative change cycle is a moment to pause and reflect, and then kind of realign so that we have enough energy to keep going.
Mm.
And the last thing I'll say about this is that it feels to me like very, very clear that energy is a finite resource. And we have to learn better how to replenish it. Otherwise, it will just show up in really damaging health effects. The repercussions are unavoidable. So,
Mm.
new tools to help us figure out how to regenerate can only serve the productivity and the goals of any company,
Mm.
any academic institution, because it's actually thinking about how to feed the people who are making growth happen in our world today.
Mm, absolutely. And certainly something that, we totally resonate with together, because we've both been there. We've both been in that stage of burnout, and we both have talked openly, about our experiences in different, circumstances. And it's just not a fun place to be at all. And I think it's an interesting one, because I think generally a lot of people are aware, like, we don't want to be really, really stressed or really burnt out, but yet there's this perpetual cycle happening, that we keep feeling the need to keep going, and then we find our limits, and it's not a good place to be. I especially love the part of your cycle where you talk about the ecosystem, and actually, making the, like, considered choice about what you're kind of entering into, and what it looks like and feels like. That was I found that really powerful. So I think you've really hit on a really important point there, that, especially for professionals today, celebrating success and celebrating what that looks like to us in many ways is really important, not just focusing on what the challenge is and what things we need to avoid and what we need to do better. It's like, we need to have that, everything needs balance in life, right? So we do need to make sure that we are also addressing the good things that are manifesting. But if you had someone listening to this and they were saying, this all sounds really great and I want to, but where do I even start, for myself or for my team, what would you say is like a helpful first step that can be like easily implementable or actionable for someone?
Yes, it's interesting. Like, this is what I do. So I guide communities and individuals through mini sabbaticals, like how to do it.
Yeah.
What I would say, just, for like one small step, is to take a pause and write down what a small win looks like. Because I think in our culture, it's like we only notice or maybe take credit for the big wins. And so a harvest, the other day we harvested our olives, and it was a pretty small harvest this year because olives take a break. They produce intensively one year, and then they will produce a very small harvest the next year. And so, we had a small basket of olives, and there is that feeling of like, oh, this is all we're gonna have for the whole year. I'm like, we could have finished this in 2 days. We
Yeah.
love olives.
I find
And
that with aubergines as well sometimes, like the way that they grow, you're like, oh, it's so small, but I just have to like really savor it.
right.
Yeah.
So I think it's like a mindset shift to think, all right, here we go. It's small, but I'm still going to celebrate it, because
Mm.
it's kind of like against the odds. We got here.
Yeah.
There's something to celebrate.
Yeah.
Um, and God knows we are really good at hammering the opposite, what
Mm.
doesn't work. We're
Mm.
all, our internal dialogues can be extremely harsh, but
Mm.
certainly, like, workplace culture is renowned for really kind of demanding perfection.
Mm.
And we're not automating every position in every corporation, in every sector. We are human beings. And so to allow for a little more spaciousness, to recognize that people need to be celebrated for those small wins. Like, if I celebrate some folks in my staff that have been working, like, I used to run a nonprofit. I ran nonprofits for 20 years.
Mm.
So if I take the time to just recognize, like, you have done something exceptional
Mm.
in over this campaign, thank you.
Mm.
And then maybe put this person's picture in our newsletter and really reward and celebrate all that they have contributed, they
Mm.
might be more likely to want to give more
Mm.
after they've had a chance to follow, than
Yeah.
if it's like, well, we didn't hit our numbers and we didn't affect the change
Mm.
yet because that village still doesn't have the water that it needs to. Like, I was working in villages inside Israel and Palestine that don't have access to water, to drinking water. And so my big mistake, what led me to the clenched teeth of burnout, was I was like, okay, we built a medical clinic in this unrecognized village, but that's not enough because these 5,000 villagers still don't have access to drinking water.
Mm,
See, it's like we didn't hit our marks. We didn't actually affect change. And that's very depleting. That's very tricky way to like want to get up the next morning
mm,
and it's a
mm,
fundraise for the next campaign.
mm.
So I think celebrating small wins is something really small that we can all begin to think differently about.
Because even with that example, like you still created this medical center, which is something to be hugely proud of. But I think that's really powerful that, like, even with that, how your attention would focus to, but we need to do this, or but we need to affect that, and yet sitting in actually what did we do, what did we actually affect, and what did we create is also massively important, because like you say, it affects your motivation. And actually, don't multiple studies show these days that when you do reward people's efforts, even just through things that don't cost you anything, like to say thank you and to recognize great work, they are much more likely to give more of themselves to their work and to their teams.
100%.
Mm,
This is like it's renowned in like activist culture that there are times when we are just like cannibalistic. We are just hammering each other
mm,
and competing for a limited slice of the donor pie. So we
mm,
have to, and that kind of the donors demand that you're really pushing as hard as you can. And research by Paul Gorski and his team on burnout among activists in radical like racial justice circles
mm,
also like it points to this, that if we can find ways of like having more small rituals, like small celebrations in our communities, in our circles,
mm,
that can do so much to just boost the morale.
mm, mm,
So um I really love the idea of pausing to share what we've learned and say thank you more,
mm,
humbling ourselves, not just to the bottom line, the dollar,
mm,
the profit margin,
mm,
but to that experience of growing relationships between people such that we have created a process that works. We have figured out a way to feed our people, our
mm.
system, our team is working. Not the only, it's not only a measure of our efficacy and our achievements and getting our metrics met.
Mm,
Um, it's really a subtle shift
mm.
of mind that can be vast.
Absolutely. And, the reality is that as human beings, we all share very similar basic human needs. Like when you meet the need to feel understood, to feel appreciated, to feel valued, to feel listened to, like your voice matters, like it contributes to something. Meeting those needs means, I mean, multiple studies show this, as I mentioned before, that meeting those needs will transform the way that your team communicate with one another, the way that people will work for you, the way that they will contribute, and it costs you nothing. That's the amazing thing about it. It's just how we connect, and we also thrive on connecting with other human beings. It's a big part of what makes us human, so we don't really do so well necessarily in long periods of time in solitude or in isolation. We actually need others to boost our sense of well-being and happiness as well at different times. So how can people get in touch with you, Devorah? Because you do, like you say, these wonderful sabbatical like retreats for professionals and for individuals, people from all walks of life, really. So how can people find out more about getting in touch with you and connecting with you on what you offer?
Thank you. I have a website and maybe we could post a link to it
Yeah, we
after
will.
the video.
Mhm.
And folks can also reach out to me. I'm extremely happy to connect. And um, I really feel so grateful to you for creating space for this conversation.
Mhm.
And I'm really excited about the work of Calmer and what you're putting into the world. Um, and I want to just say that I appreciate the opportunity to explore a subject which can be really sticky and
Mhm.
really tricky. because we all have to kind of be on all the time and pretend that everything's, great. But
Yeah.
you know what it's like when you're hurting inside and people are still having unbelievable demands for your time.
Yeah.
I think that the bottom line for me is the only person who can ever begin to draw a clear boundary is you. I was
Mm,
like, you are the only one who knows I have crossed my own limits right now. I need to figure out how to take a pause.
mm,
Our culture doesn't ask us that question,
mhm,
but by becoming more mindful, by applying the tools that you're teaching in the communities, and by really taking a moment to think, this is not me alone. I'm not the only one that's going through burnout. In
mm,
fact, it's massive.
mm,
It's an epidemic.
mhm.
And it's okay for me to tap into what my body's feeling and pause and say, can't do that right now. Need
Yeah.
to pause.
Yeah, because also it's thinking, what's the alternative if I don't do this? Sometimes, I like to think of it in that way, and that often helps, the people that we support as well. It's, we can easily say to ourselves, I can't do that. I can't do that. I shoulding as well as another one. I shouldn't do this or I should do that, right? But actually asking ourselves that reflective question, what if I do keep going, and what does that look like? Actually, what is the alternative if I, don't stop and I just keep going on this trajectory, and what's that going to be like for me? But thank you very much for your kind words. I really appreciate that, Devorah, and all the support that you give Karma as well. And I'm obviously clearly a fan of your work and what you do. So it's been an absolute pleasure to spend time with you here today. It's from Soil 2 with the number soil2soul.com, isn't it? Your website. Yeah,
Yes,
great. And are you on social platforms as well?
I am. I'm on Instagram at dev.brous.
Mm-hmm.
And I am also on Facebook and LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
Be delighted to be in touch with anybody in the community.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Devorah. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for all the wisdom that you've given us today. I'm certainly feeling more centered after what you've shared. So thank you.
Brilliant. All right. Have a beautiful evening.
Thank you. And have a beautiful day to you.